You're not crazy, but someone made you believe you were for a very long time. You started to question yourself. Things you were once certain about slowly became unclear. You found yourself asking, am I too sensitive? Am I overreacting? And the strange part is, you weren't like this before you met them. Before that, you understood your emotions. You knew what felt right and what didn't. You didn't feel the need to constantly explain yourself or apologize just because something didn't sit right with you. But then, little by little, everything began to change. Seemingly harmless comments, moments where your feelings were dismissed, times when they made you feel like you were the one at fault, repeated often enough that you started to believe maybe the problem really was you. You tried to understand them more, to speak more gently, to become a more easygoing version of yourself. But the more you tried, the more exhausted you became. And deep down, a part of you knew something wasn't right. You just couldn't quite name it. The truth is, you never lost control. You were simply in a situation where your emotions were constantly being twisted, and when that goes on long enough, you start to lose trust in yourself. People like that don't enter your life by accident. They observe, carefully, quietly, and patiently, long enough to figure out who opens up easily, who is empathetic, and who will keep trying to hold a relationship together even when it starts to feel exhausting. You weren't chosen because you're weak. You were chosen because you feel deeply, because you understand others, and because you tend to think of others before yourself. At the beginning, everything can feel normal, maybe even special. You feel seen, noticed, cared for in a way that draws you in. But that feeling is exactly where it starts. Because once you're used to giving, used to listening, you're also more likely to accept that you have to try harder to keep things stable. And they know that. They don't need to rush. Step by step, they move you into a position where you're always explaining, always adjusting, always questioning whether you've done enough. At some point, you don't even realize you're being led anymore, because it all feels so natural. And when doubt begins to creep in, you respond by trying harder, because you believe that if you just do better, everything will be okay. But that's the loop that keeps you there far longer than you ever expected. They don't actually care whether you're right or wrong. What they care about is whether you react. You can present clear arguments, explain things logically, even bring evidence, and the conversation still goes nowhere, because their goal was never to understand you. Their goal is to keep you talking, keep you explaining, and keep you engaged in that exchange for as long as possible. Every time you try to clarify things, you're unintentionally giving them exactly what they want most, your attention and emotional energy. They may twist your words, change the subject, or make you feel like you're saying too much, saying it wrong, or still not saying enough. And you keep trying because you believe that if you just phrase it the right way, they'll finally understand. But the truth is, you're being pulled into a game with no finish line. A conversation where the rules keep shifting, and you're always the one chasing after them. What exhausts you isn't the topic itself. It's the feeling of never truly being heard. The more you react, the more they have to keep it going. And once you start to see that, you realize the problem was never in how you spoke. It was in speaking to someone who never intended to listen in the first place. The more you try to explain, the more you lose control. At first, you just want to clear up a small misunderstanding. You just want things to feel more transparent. But then the conversation drags on, spills into other topics, and suddenly you find yourself explaining even the most basic things that should never have needed justification in the first place. You start talking more, adding more detail, choosing your words more carefully, just to avoid being misunderstood. But the harder you try to control how you speak, the deeper you're pulled into a reactive position, because while you're trying to keep the conversation on track, they keep shifting that track. They may twist your words, take parts of what you said out of context, or make you feel like you're contradicting yourself. And so you keep going, explaining again, correcting, adding more, as if just one more attempt will finally make them understand. But it never does. Instead, you become drained, not because you're wrong, but because you're trying to play a game where the rules are never fixed. Every time you explain, you hand them back control, because you're responding exactly how they want you to, and Eventually, you begin to see it clearly. The problem isn't that you haven't explained well enough. It's that you're speaking in a space where clarity was never valued to begin with. The only way out isn't to explain better. It's to become more uninteresting. It sounds strange, but that's exactly what makes them lose control the most. When you stop reacting, stop showing emotion, stop engaging in endless arguments, you're cutting off the very energy they rely on. You don't have to be cold or rude. Just keep your responses short, neutral, and emotionally flat. No over-explaining, no expanding the conversation, no trying to make them understand. At first, this will feel incredibly difficult because you're used to reacting. You're used to wanting clarity. It may feel like you're leaving things unfinished, like you're not doing enough. But in reality, you're doing something completely different. You're stepping out of a loop that has no ending. When you stop providing emotional fuel, they may try harder, provoking you, shifting the narrative, even creating pressure, just to pull you back in. But if you can maintain that calm detachment long enough, they'll eventually lose interest. Not because they suddenly understand you, but because you're no longer a source they can draw from. And that's the moment you begin to take your control back. One of the biggest reasons you stayed so long was the hope that one day they would finally understand you. That if you were just a little more patient, a little clearer, or behaved a little more right, things would change. You waited for acknowledgement, for that one moment where they would admit you weren't wrong, that your feelings made sense. But the longer you waited, the more disappointed you became, because that acknowledgement was never something they were willing to give. And deep down, you started to feel like you had to earn being understood. You tried to be better, more agreeable, quieter when needed, more precise when you spoke, just to receive a small amount of empathy in return. But it was never enough. Not because you didn't do enough, but because you were asking for something from someone who isn't capable of giving it in the way you need. Once you begin to see this, you realize how much of your self-worth you placed in how they perceived you. And that's why every time they dismissed you, it hurt so deeply. Letting go of the need for their validation doesn't mean you don't deserve to be understood. It means you stop trying to get that understanding from the wrong person. And when you finally stop, you begin to see the truth. Your worth was never dependent on whether they could recognize it. And then you'll realize something very strange. The thing that makes them lose control the most isn't when you fight back. It's when you become silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from suppression, not silence that endures, but a conscious silence where you no longer feel the need to explain, no longer feel the need to prove anything, and no longer get pulled into conversations that drain you. Before, whenever something happened, you reacted immediately. You wanted to clarify, to fix, to make sure nothing was misunderstood. But that very reflex is what kept you in the loop for so long. When you begin to pause, not responding right away, not engaging with provocations, not continuing conversations that are clearly going off track, you're doing something fundamentally different. You're no longer playing by their rules. At first, they won't be used to it. They may push harder, talk more, even try to provoke you back into your old patterns. But if you can hold on to that silence long enough, not as cold detachment, but as a calm, grounded state, they will gradually lose their ability to control you. Not because you've defeated them, but because you've stepped out of the game entirely. And in that moment, you'll feel something very clear, quiet. No more tension, no more second guessing, no more wondering where you went wrong. Just you, more stable, more certain, and no longer pulled in by reactions that were never truly yours to carry.